You lie awake at night, your mind racing with worries and regrets, while others seem to sleep peacefully despite facing similar struggles. Every evening becomes a battle against your own thoughts, leaving you exhausted and wondering why contentment feels so impossibly out of reach. I am Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher who spent a lifetime studying human suffering and discovered the path to genuine peace of mind. What I discovered about the wisdom of life will transform how you understand your daily struggles and show you the way to inner peace by understanding the very nature of existence itself. The same wisdom that guided me through my own dark nights can guide you toward the peaceful rest you deserve. But first, like this video, subscribe for more philosophical wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to discover the true wisdom of life. Let me take you back to my earliest days, when the seeds of my philosophy were planted in the fertile ground of personal suffering. I was born in 1788 in the merchant city of Danzig, into a world that seemed determined to crush the sensitive soul before it could fully bloom. My father, Heinrich, was a successful businessman who envisioned for me a life of commerce and material prosperity. But even as a child, I felt something fundamentally wrong with this vision of success. The leather-bound journal I kept during those formative years tells a story of mounting despair and philosophical awakening. Page after page reveals a young man wrestling with questions that seem to have no answers. Why do we suffer? Why does happiness always slip away just when we think we've grasped it? Why does life feel like an endless cycle of wanting and disappointment? My relationship with my mother, Johanna, was particularly tormented. She was a woman of society, brilliant in her own right, hosting salons and writing novels. But between us stretched a chasm of misunderstanding that would never fully close. In my letters to her, preserved now in my personal archive, you can see the raw pain of a son who could never meet his mother's expectations, and a mother who could never understand her son's melancholic disposition. Arthur, she would say, why must you always see the dark side of everything? Life offers so many pleasures, so many opportunities for joy. But I had already begun to suspect that what she called joy was merely the temporary absence of pain, a brief respite in an otherwise continuous struggle against suffering. My travels across Europe as a young man only confirmed these early intuitions. In Hamburg, I witnessed the brutal realities of maritime commerce sailors returning broken from voyages, merchants destroying competitors without mercy, the poor laboring under conditions that would have been called slavery in any honest society. In London, I walked through neighborhoods where children aged before their time, where desperation wore 1,000 different faces, but always told the same story of want and unfulfillment. But it was in Dresden, during my university years, that the full weight of existence began to press upon my consciousness. I remember one particular evening, sitting alone in my small apartment, when the reality of human existence revealed itself to me with startling clarity. We are born without our consent into a world we never made, driven by desires we did not choose toward goals that ultimately satisfy nothing deeper than temporary physical needs. The depression that followed this revelation was so profound that I feared for my sanity. Sleep became my enemy, not because I could not achieve it, but because waking meant returning to a world that seemed fundamentally hostile to human happiness. I began to understand why so many people busied themselves with trivial pursuits. The alternative was to confront the essentially tragic nature of existence itself. Yet it was precisely this confrontation with despair that began to shape my philosophical mission. If suffering was indeed the fundamental condition of human life, then the greatest service I could perform would be to understand why this was so, and whether there might be any escape from this condition. Most people, I realized, lived their entire lives without ever asking these questions directly. They were too busy pursuing the very desires that kept them trapped in cycles of dissatisfaction. My early philosophical notebooks reveal a young man determined to trace suffering to its source, no matter how painful the investigation might prove to be. I began to suspect that the problem lay not in our circumstances, but in something much deeper, in the very structure of consciousness itself, in the way we experience desire and identity. This suspicion would eventually blossom into my central insight about the nature of will, but first I had to endure years of personal torment that nearly broke my spirit entirely. The breakthrough came to me like lightning, illuminating a dark landscape, sudden, brilliant, and revelatory of everything that had been hidden in shadow. I was 26 years old, hunched over my heavily annotated copy of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, when the pieces of the philosophical puzzle suddenly arranged themselves into a coherent picture. The margins of that book are filled with my excited scrawls. The moment when I realized what Kant had called the thing in itself was nothing other than what I would come to call will. But let me explain what I mean by will, for this concept is the cornerstone of everything I discovered about human existence. Will is not the conscious decision-making faculty we ordinarily think of when we use that word. No, will is something far more fundamentally. It is the blind, irrational force that drives all existence, the energy that pushes the plant toward sunlight, that compels the animal to seek food and reproduction, that urges us humans toward our countless desires and ambitions. I remember the exact moment this insight crystallized. I was walking through the botanical gardens in Berlin, observing how every living thing seemed possessed by an internal drive that knew no rest. The climbing vine wrapped itself around whatever support it could find, growing relentlessly upward, toward light. The birds in the trees were in constant motion, building nests, finding food, competing for mates. Even the trees themselves, seemingly so still and peaceful, were engaged in fierce competition, their roots fighting for nutrients in the soil, their branches stretching toward every available ray of sunshine. And then I understood, this same force that drives the vine and the bird and the tree is what drives us. We are not rational beings who occasionally have desires. We are desire itself, temporarily housed in these bodies, momentarily focused through these minds. The will that moves the universe moves through us, and we mistake its movements for our own conscious choices. This was both terrifying and liberating to realize. Terrifying because it meant that the sense of being in control of our lives was largely an illusion. The will decides what we want, when we want it, how intensely we pursue it. We are like passengers on a ship who believe they are steering, when actually the current carries us wherever it will. But it was also liberating because it explained why satisfaction always proves temporary, why achieving our goals never brings the lasting peace we expected. The will, you see, is essentially striving itself. It is want, need, lack. When we satisfy one desire, the will immediately generates another. This is why the wealthy remain restless, why the powerful continue grasping for more power, why even the most successful among us often report feeling empty despite their achievements. They are trying to satisfy something that is by nature insatiable. I began to observe this principle everywhere in my own experience. My sexual desires, my ambition to be recognized as a great philosopher, my need for comfortable living conditions, none of these arose from rational calculation about what would make me happy. They arose spontaneously from the will working through me, using my body and mind as instruments for its own perpetuation. Even more disturbing was the realization that the will operates through us largely unconsciously. We construct elaborate, rational justifications for what we want, but these are usually after the fact, explanations for desires that spring from much deeper sources. The man who pursues wealth tells himself it's for security or freedom, but really he's driven by the will's endless hunger for more. The woman who seeks romantic love believes it's for companionship and joy, but But actually, she's responding to the will's demand for reproduction and genetic continuity. This insight began to explain why human relationships are so often sources of conflict rather than harmony. Each person is driven by their own will, and these individual wills necessarily compete with one another. What I want often interferes with what you want. My success may require your failure. My pleasure may depend on your labor. The will sets us against each other in ways that our conscious minds often don't even recognize. Understanding this made me see why the world contains so much suffering. It's not that suffering is accidental or avoidably, it's built into the very structure of existence. We suffer when we want things we cannot have. We suffer when we lose things we have obtained. We suffer from boredom when our immediate wants are satisfied, but the will has not yet generated new desires. There is no stable state of contentment, because contentment would mean the will had stopped willing, which is impossible as long as we live. Once I understood the nature of will, I faced an even more perplexing question. If this blind force is the true reality behind all existence, then what exactly is this world of objects and people and events that we experience every day? The answer came to me through careful study of how our minds construct experience itself. And I found myself drawing a sketch of Plato's famous cave allegory to illustrate the profound deception under which we all live. The world as we experience it, what I call the world as representation, is not reality itself, but rather reality filtered through the peculiar structure of human consciousness. Our minds are like colored glasses that tint everything we see. Space, time, and causality are not features of the world itself, but rather the forms through which our intellect organizes the raw data of experience. We never encounter the will directly. We encounter only its manifestations as they appear to. Consciousness structured by these fundamental categories. Think about this carefully. You have never actually seen an object, only the representation of an object as it appears to your consciousness. You have never directly experienced another person's mind, only the physical behaviors through which their will manifests itself to your perception. Even your own body is known to you in two completely different ways: from the inside as will, as immediate desire and striving, and from the outside as representation, as a physical object moving through space and time. This insight revolutionized my understanding of individual identity. What we call the self or the ego is largely a construction of the representational world. In truth, the boundaries between individuals are nowhere near as solid as they appear. At the level of will, there is ultimately only one force expressing itself through countless temporary manifestations. You and I appear separate because we experience the world through different bodies, different nervous systems, different points of view, but this separateness exists only in the world of representation. I spent many evenings contemplating this truth while staring into the mirror in my study. The face looking back at me was just another representation, another way the one will appeared to itself through the lens of individual consciousness. Behind that face, beneath the thoughts and memories and personal history that seemed to make me Arthur Schopenhauer, was the same force that moved through every living thing. This realization began to dissolve many of the sources of my personal suffering: the desperate need to be recognized as a great philosopher, the envy I felt toward other thinkers who achieved fame while my work remained obscure, the fear of death that had haunted me since childhood. All of these concerns belonged to the world of representation, to the illusory individual self that took itself to be separate from the rest of existence. Understanding the distinction between will and representation also explained why knowledge alone could never provide lasting satisfaction. The intellect operates entirely within the world of representation. It can analyze, categorize, and understand the appearances of things, but it cannot directly grasp the reality that underlies these appearances. This is why purely intellectual achievements, no matter how brilliant, always leave us feeling somehow empty. They satisfy the mind but leave the will untouched, still driving us toward new desires and new dissatisfactions. Yet this same insight suggested a possible path toward liberation. If suffering arises from the will's endless striving, and if our ordinary consciousness is trapped within the world of representation where individual will seems separate from universal will, then perhaps there were moments when consciousness could transcend these limitations. Perhaps there were states of awareness in which the individual will could become quiet, allowing consciousness to perceive reality more directly. I began to notice such moments in my own experience. Sometimes while walking in nature, sometimes while deeply absorbed in reading, sometimes in the presence of great art, the constant chattering of personal desire would fall silent. In these moments, I was no longer Arthur Schopenhauer wanting this or fearing that. I was pure consciousness, aware of the world without the filter of personal will. These experiences were brief but profound, offering glimpses of what existence might be like without the constant pressure of individual striving. The world of representation, I realized, was like a stage play in which we had become so absorbed that we forgot we were watching a performance. We identified completely with our characters. Our individual selves became caught up in their dramas of desire and frustration, but occasionally something would remind us that this was only a play, that our true nature was not the character, but the consciousness witnessing the entire performance. This understanding would become crucial for everything that followed in my philosophical development. For if individual selfhood was largely illusory, if the boundaries between self and other existed primarily in the world of representation, then perhaps the suffering caused by individual will could be transcended. Perhaps there were ways of living that acknowledged this deeper truth about the nature of existence. My visits to hospitals and asylums throughout Europe provided me with a grim education in the universality of human pain, and I filled notebook after notebook with observations that confirmed my philosophical insights about the nature of suffering. In those places where human misery was most concentrated and visible, I saw with perfect clarity that suffering is not an accident or deviation from life's proper course. It is life's most essential. Characteristic is the ICT. I remember walking through the wards of a London hospital, observing patients in various stages of physical agony, and being struck not by the variety of their conditions, but by the fundamental similarity of their expressions. Whether they suffered from disease, injury, or mental disturbance, they all wore the same look of bewilderment as if they could not quite believe that existence had subjected them to such pain. This look haunted me for years, because I recognized in it my own secret face, the expression I wore in private moments when I confronted the basic facts of human existence. The truth I discovered through these observations is that suffering has three fundamental sources, and every human being oscillates constantly between them like a pendulum that can never find rest. We suffer, first, from want, from the gap between what we desire and what we possess. This is the most obvious form of suffering, the one that drives most human activity. We want food when we are hungry, shelter when we are cold, companionship when we are lonely, recognition when we feel invisible, security when we feel threatened. But here is what most people do not realize. Satisfying our wants does not eliminate suffering. It merely transforms it into the second type, which is boredom. When we have obtained what we thought we needed, when our immediate desires are fulfilled, we discover that satisfaction brings not peace but a kind of existential emptiness. The will that drove us so urgently toward our goals suddenly has no clear direction, and we find ourselves restless, listless, looking around for something new to want. I experienced this pattern countless times in my own life. The completion of a philosophical work would bring momentary satisfaction, followed quickly by a kind of depression when I realized that finishing the book had not transformed my fundamental condition. The achievement of financial security through my inheritance provided relief from one source of anxiety, only to reveal new forms of worry about maintaining and protecting what I had gained. Even the rare occasions when I received recognition for my ideas brought joy so brief that it seemed almost mocking. The third source of suffering is acute pain, physical illness, injury, loss, betrayal, the death of those we love. This type of suffering is so overwhelming that it drowns out the other two temporarily. When we are in severe pain, we do not suffer from want or boredom. We suffer from the immediate reality of our condition. But this very intensity makes acute pain self-limiting. It either resolves or destroys us. It cannot be sustained indefinitely. What makes human existence particularly tragic is that we cannot avoid all three forms of suffering simultaneously. If we are not wanting, we are bored. If we are not bored, we are either wanting or in pain. There is no fourth state of pure contentment, no stable condition in which the will rests satisfied and at peace. This is why even the most successful lives, when examined closely, reveal themselves to be elaborate strategies for managing different types of suffering rather than eliminating suffering altogether. I began to understand why most people refuse to look directly at this reality. The businessman throws himself into the pursuit of wealth to avoid confronting the emptiness that lies beneath his ambitions. The socialite fills her calendar with engagements to escape the boredom that threatens. Whenever she sits alone with her thoughts, the scholar loses himself in research to avoid facing the ultimate futility of intellectual achievement. We stay busy, we pursue goals, we make plans not because these activities bring genuine satisfaction, but because they distract us from the fundamental groundlessness of our condition. Even our pleasures, I realized, are not positive states, but merely temporary reliefs from pain. The pleasure of eating is relief from hunger. The pleasure of rest is relief from fatigue. The pleasure of companionship is relief from loneliness. The pleasure of achievement is relief from the anxiety of failure. What we call happiness is simply the momentary absence of suffering, and it lasts only until the will generates new desires, new sources of dissatisfaction. This insight explained why pursuing happiness directly is such a futile strategy. You cannot aim at relief and expect to hit satisfaction. You cannot build a positive life on the foundation of avoiding negative experiences. The very structure of consciousness makes lasting contentment impossible, because contentment would require the will to stop willing, which would mean the cessation of life itself. Yet understanding this did not drive me to despair, though it came close. Instead, it began to point toward a different kind of wisdom, the wisdom of trying to win a game that cannot be won, but the wisdom of understanding the rules so clearly that you no longer take the game quite so seriously. If suffering was indeed unavoidable, then perhaps the path to peace lay not in avoiding suffering, but in changing our relationship to it. The mirror in my study became an object of profound philosophical contemplation, for in its surface I began to see not just my own face, but the fundamental deception that underlies all human conflict and suffering. What looked back at me appeared to be a separate individual, distinct from all other beings, with his own private thoughts, his own unique history, his own particular destiny. But I had begun to suspect that this appearance of separateness was the greatest illusion of all. The principle of individuation, as I came to understand it, is the mechanism by which the one universal will appears to divide itself into countless separate beings. Space and time, the basic forms through which we experience the world, create boundaries that seem to separate you from me, your body from my body, your thoughts from my thoughts. But these boundaries exist only in the world of representation. At the deeper level of will, there is no real separation at all. Consider what happens when you cut a river with a sword. The blade passes through the water, seeming to divide it into two parts. But the moment you lift the sword, the water flows back together as if it had never been separated. The division was only apparent, only temporary, only from the perspective of someone who mistook the surface for the reality. In the same way, individual beings are like temporary eddies in the stream of universal will, appearing separate for a moment, but essentially continuous with the whole. This realization began to transform my understanding of human relationships and the sources of conflict between people. When I felt envy toward another philosopher whose work received more recognition than mine, I was experiencing the illusion that his success somehow diminished my own worth. But if we were both temporary manifestations of the same underlying reality, then his achievement was no more separate from me than my left hand's movement is separate from my right hand's movement. The competition that seemed so natural and inevitable between individuals for resources, for status, for love, for attention arises entirely from this mistaken sense of separateness. We fight each other like waves in the ocean fighting for more water, not realizing that we are all made of the same substance. The businessman who destroys a competitor, the lover who feels threatened by a rival, the child who hoards toys from siblings, all are acting out the drama of individual will, without recognizing the deeper unity that underlies their apparent separateness. I began to notice moments in my own experience when this illusion of separateness temporarily dissolved, sometimes while reading a particularly moving passage of literature, sometimes while listening to music that seemed to speak directly to my soul, sometimes while observing the natural world in moments of perfect stillness. The boundaries of individual selfhood would become transparent. In these moments, I was no longer defending Arthur Schopenhauer against the world. I was simply consciousness itself, aware of its own manifestations without the need to claim some manifestations as mine and reject others as not mine. These experiences, though brief, revealed the source of genuine compassion. When you truly understand that the suffering of others is not fundamentally different from your own suffering, that the same will that creates your pain creates theirs, then caring for others becomes as natural as caring for yourself. You help alleviate their suffering, not out of moral duty or social obligation, but because their suffering literally is your suffering, experienced through a different nervous system. This insight explained why conventional morality, based on rules and commandments imposed from outside, so often fails to produce genuine ethical behavior. When you tell someone they should care for others because it is their duty, you are asking them to act against their perceived self-interest. But when someone truly sees through the illusion of separateness, caring for others becomes a natural expression of enlightened self-interest. You protect and nurture other beings because you recognize them as other faces of your own deepest self. Conversely, cruelty and indifference arise from the delusion of separateness. The person who can inflict suffering on others without feeling their pain has become completely identified with their individual will, completely convinced that their boundaries are real and absolute. They experience other beings as fundamentally foreign, as objects to be used, or obstacles to be overcome, rather than as different expressions of the same essential nature. I spent many evenings walking through the streets of Frankfurt, observing how this principle played out in everyday human interactions. The merchant who cheated his customers, the official who abused his authority, the wealthy woman who passed by beggars without a glance, so were acting from the delusion that their individual welfare could be improved at the expense of others. They had forgotten, or perhaps never realized, that at the deepest level there are no others. But I also witnessed moments of spontaneous compassion that seemed to arise from some intuitive recognition of this underlying unity. The stranger who stopped to help an injured animal, the neighbor who shared food with a hungry family, the friend who listened patiently to another's troubles. In these actions, I could see the individual will temporarily stepping aside to allow the deeper wisdom of universal connection to express itself. Understanding the illusory nature of individuality did not eliminate my own ego or transform me overnight into a saint. I continued to feel the pull of personal desires, continued to experience envy and fear and anger, but these emotions began to feel less solid, less absolutely real. They were like weather patterns passing through the sky of consciousness, enough in their temporary manifestation, but not permanent features of the landscape. My collection of Beethoven's sheet music became far more than entertainment. It became my laboratory for understanding how consciousness could temporarily escape the tyranny of individual will. When I listened to the late quartets or the final piano sonatas, something extraordinary happened. The constant chatter of personal desire fell silent, and I found myself in a state of pure perception, free from the endless cycle of wanting and disappointment that normally dominated my mental life. This was my first glimpse into what I would come to understand as aesthetic experience, a unique mode of consciousness in which we temporarily transcend our individual will and become pure subjects of knowing. In these moments, we are no longer Arthur Schopenhauer wanting recognition, or you wanting security, or anyone wanting anything at all. We become will-less contemplation itself, absorbed completely in the object of our attention. I remember the precise moment this insight crystallized for me. I was attending a performance of Mozart's Requiem in Vienna, and as the Lacrimosa movement reached its climax, I realized that I had completely forgotten myself, my usual concerns about my philosophical career, my anxieties about financial security, my irritation with critics who misunderstood my work. All of this had simply vanished. I was not Arthur Schopenhauer listening to music. I was the music itself, experiencing itself through temporary focal point of consciousness. This state felt profoundly different from ordinary pleasure. When I satisfied a physical desire or achieved a personal goal, the pleasure was always tinged with a knowledge that it would not last, that new desires would soon arise to disturb my temporary satisfaction. But aesthetic experience had a quality of timelessness, of completeness, that needed nothing added to it. In those moments of pure contemplation, the will's endless striving simply stopped. I began to understand why great art has such power over us. A masterful painting does not simply show us objects arranged in pleasing ways. It reveals the eternal ideas that lie behind the world of appearances. When we stand before a Van Rooijesdael landscape or a portrait by Rembrandt, we are not looking at mere representations of trees or human faces. We are seeing through the surface of things to the essential patterns that give form to existence itself. Music, I discovered, works differently from the other arts, and this difference revealed something crucial about the nature of reality. While painting and sculpture and poetry represent the world of appearances, music bypasses representation entirely and speaks directly to us of the will itself, the movement of melody, the tension and resolution of harmony, the rhythmic pulse that drives a composition forward. These mirror exactly the movement of will through all existence. This is why music affects us so powerfully without needing to represent anything specific. A Beethoven symphony does not tell us a story about particular characters or events, yet it can move us to tears or lift us to heights of exaltation that no mere narrative could achieve. Music is the immediate expression of will itself, speaking to the will within us in its own language, bypassing entirely the world of concepts and representations. In these moments of aesthetic contemplation, I experienced what I can only describe as a kind of temporary salvation. The individual will, with all its demands and frustrations, became quiet. The boundaries of personal identity became transparent. Time seemed to stop, or rather, consciousness entered a timeless dimension where past and future collapsed into an eternal present of pure awareness. But here lay both the glory and the limitation of aesthetic experience. It could not be permanently sustained. The most profound moment of artistic revelation would eventually fade, and I would find myself back in the world of individual desire, once again caught up in the cycle of wanting and striving that defines ordinary consciousness. The music would end, I would leave the concert hall, and within hours or days I would be as trapped by personal will as I had ever been. This transitory nature of aesthetic liberation taught me something important about the structure of consciousness itself. The capacity for willless knowing exists within us always, but it is normally overshadowed by the noise of individual desire. Art does not create this capacity, simply provides the conditions under which our deeper nature can temporarily reveal itself. I began to seek out these experiences more deliberately, spending hours in galleries, attending concerts, reading poetry with the kind of attention that allowed the words to work their transformative magic. Each genuine aesthetic experience was like a brief vacation from the prison of individual selfhood, a reminder that there were other ways of being conscious, other possibilities for human existence. The artist, I realized, was someone who had developed the ability to access this will-less state more readily than most people, and whose gift lay in creating works that could induce similar states in others. The great artist was not someone who had mastered technique, though technique was necessary, but someone who had learned to step aside and allow the eternal ideas to express themselves through temporary human instruments. Yet I also understood that art alone could never provide permanent liberation from suffering. It offered glimpses of what freedom might look like, moments of respite from the will's demands, but it could not fundamentally alter the conditions of human existence. For that, something more radical would be required, a more complete transformation of consciousness that went beyond even the most profound aesthetic experience. My daily walks through Frankfurt became philosophical laboratories where I observed the natural emergence of ethical behavior from the recognition of shared humanity. With my walking stick in hand, a simple wooden companion that witnessed countless moments of moral insight, I began to understand that true morality had nothing to do with following rules imposed by external authorities, and everything to do with seeing through the illusion of separateness that normally divides us from one another. Conventional morality had always struck me as both ineffective and fundamentally dishonest. When society tells us we should help others because it is our duty, or because God commands it, or because it will benefit us in the long run, it is asking us to act against our perceived self-interest. Such morality requires constant enforcement, constant reminders, constant threats of punishment for It treats ethical behavior as a burden imposed on naturally selfish beings, rather than as the natural expression of enlightened consciousness. But what I discovered through careful observation of human behavior was that genuine compassion arises spontaneously when people see through the boundaries that seem to separate them from others. The mother who rushes to comfort her crying child does not stop to consider her moral duty. She responds immediately because the child's pain is experienced as her own pain. The stranger who helps an accident victim does not calculate the costs and benefits of intervention in that moment. The victim's suffering has become real to them in a way that makes helping as natural as breathing. I remember watching a scene that crystallized this insight for me. An elderly man had fallen in the street, and several passers-by rushed to help him up and ensure he was not injured. What struck me was not their kindness, which was admirable enough, but the expressions on their faces. They looked genuinely distressed by the old man's predicament, as if his discomfort were their own. In that moment, the usual boundaries of individual concern had dissolved, and they were responding to suffering wherever it appeared, regardless of whether it belonged to them or to someone else. This is what I mean by the metaphysical foundation of ethics. True moral behavior does not depend on following principles learned from books or authorities, depends on the direct recognition that the suffering of others is not fundamentally different from our own suffering. When this recognition is genuine, compassion becomes as automatic as self-preservation, because at the deepest level, caring for others is self-preservation. The opposite is equally true. Cruelty and indifference arise from the delusion of absolute separateness. The person who can inflict pain on others without feeling it themselves has become completely identified with their individual will, completely convinced that their boundaries are impermeable. They experience other beings as fundamentally foreign, objects as things to be manipulated, rather than as different faces of the same essential reality. I began to see this principle at work everywhere in human relationships. The employer who treated workers as mere instruments of production, the politician who viewed citizens as sources of votes rather than as fellow human beings, the lover who manipulated their partner's emotions for personal advantage, all were acting from the same fundamental error, the same failure to recognize the deeper unity that underlies apparent multiplicity. But I also witnessed moments of spontaneous compassion that seemed to spring from some intuitive understanding of this unity. The neighbor who shared food with a hungry family, the teacher who spent extra time with a struggling student, the friend who listened patiently to another's troubles without trying to fix or judge in these actions. Individual will had temporarily stepped aside to allow wisdom and love to express themselves naturally. What made these observations particularly poignant was recognizing how often I myself failed to live up to this understanding. Knowing intellectually that separateness is largely illusory did not automatically transform my emotional responses. I still felt envy when other philosophers received recognition I thought I deserved. I still felt anger when critics misunderstood my work. I still experienced irritation with people whose behavior inconvenienced me. The difference was that these reactions began to feel less solid, less justified, less like absolute truths about the nature of reality. I came to understand that the development of genuine compassion is not a matter of forcing ourselves to care about others, but of gradually dissolving the barriers that prevent us from recognizing our natural connection to all life. It is not about adding something to our moral repertoire, but about removing the obstacles that block the spontaneous flow of empathy and understanding. This insight transformed my understanding of what it means to live ethically. The goal is not to become a better person in the sense of following moral rules more consistently, but to become a more authentic person in the sense of acting from our deeper nature, rather than from the surface ego that takes itself to be separate from everything else. When we act from this deeper understanding, ethical behavior becomes as natural as a plant growing toward sunlight, not forced or artificial, but the spontaneous expression of what we truly are. The walking stick that accompanied me on these philosophical journeys became a symbol of this gradual awakening. Each day brought new opportunities to practice seeing through the illusion of separateness, new chances to respond to life from compassion rather than from fear or desire. The stick supported my steps as wisdom slowly supported my growing understanding of what it means to live with genuine care for all beings. My discovery of Eastern scriptures, Buddhist and Hindu texts that seemed to confirm my deepest philosophical insights opened my eyes to the most radical possibility of all, the complete liberation from the will's demands through what I came to call the denial of the will to live. These ancient texts, yellowed with age and marked with my countless annotations, spoke of a transformation so profound that it amounted to a fundamental reversal of the natural order of existence. The possibility first presented itself to me not through abstract reasoning, but through direct observation of individuals who seemed to have transcended the ordinary conditions of human existence. I had encountered, in my travels and readings, accounts of people who had reached such a depth of understanding about the nature of suffering that they no longer participated in the will's endless cycle of desire and satisfaction. These were not people who had simply learned to manage their desires more skillfully, but people in whom the very mechanism of wanting had somehow been turned off at its source. This was not suicide, which I understood to be actually an affirmation of the will to live. The suicidal person wants life, but wants it to be different than it is, and destroys the body in a futile attempt to escape conditions that are actually inherent in existence itself. No, what I glimpsed was something far more profound, a state in which the will that normally drives all living beings toward survival and reproduction had somehow recognized its own futility and voluntarily ceased its operations. I began to study the lives of Christian mystics, Buddhist monks, Hindu renunciates, individuals who had dedicated themselves completely to transcending worldly existence. What I found in their accounts was a consistent pattern. Through intense contemplation of the nature of suffering, combined with profound compassion for all living beings, they had reached a point where the individual will simply turned away from life itself. This turning away was not motivated by hatred of existence or by any desire for annihilation. Rather, it arose from such complete understanding of the will's operations that the illusion of individual selfhood finally collapsed entirely. When someone truly sees that all striving leads only to more striving, that all satisfaction is temporary, that all individual existence is essentially suffering, and when this seeing is combined with genuine compassion for all beings trapped in the same condition, then sometimes the will performs what can only be called a miracle. It denies itself. I remember reading accounts of the Buddha's enlightenment and recognizing in them a description of exactly this process. The future Buddha had tried every possible approach to happiness and fulfillment, wealth, pleasure, extreme asceticism, scholarly learning, and found them all wanting. But rather than falling into despair, he reached a state of such profound understanding that the very mechanism of personal desire simply stopped operating. He continued to exist in a physical body, continued to teach and help others, but the driving force of individual will had been permanently transcended. The Christian mystics describe similar experiences using different language. They spoke of dying to the world, of the complete surrender of personal will to divine will, of a union with God so complete that individual selfhood disappeared entirely. Behind the theological vocabulary, I recognized the same essential transformation, the cessation of individual willing and the emergence of a consciousness that no longer operated from the perspective of separate selfhood. What fascinated me about these accounts was that the people who underwent this transformation did not become inactive or withdrawn from life in any pathological sense. On the contrary, they often became extraordinarily effective at helping others. But their actions no longer arose from personal motivation. They were like hollow reeds through which universal compassion could flow without obstruction from individual desire. I must confess that this possibility both attracted and terrified me. Part of me longed for such complete liberation from the burden of individual existence, from the endless cycle of wanting and disappointment that had characterized my entire life. But another part of me recoiled from what seemed like the ultimate extinction of everything I had taken to be myself. Through long contemplation, I came to understand that this denial of the will to live was not something that could be achieved through effort or technique. It was not a goal that the individual will could pursue, because the very act of pursuing it would be an affirmation of individual will. Rather, it was something that sometimes emerged spontaneously from the deepest possible understanding of existence, combined with the most complete compassion for universal suffering. Most people, I realized, would never reach this ultimate liberation, and perhaps it was not necessary that they should. For the vast majority of human beings, the path of wisdom lay not in transcending the will entirely, but in understanding its operations. clearly enough to minimize unnecessary suffering. But knowing that such complete freedom was possible, even if only for a few exceptional individuals, cast all of human existence in a different light. The Eastern scriptures that had revealed this possibility to me became treasured companions, evidence that the insights I had reached through Western philosophical methods were not merely personal opinions, but discoveries about the fundamental nature of reality itself. The fact that contemplatives, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, had arrived at essentially the same understanding gave me confidence that these insights pointed toward objective truths about the human condition rather than mere subjective preferences or cultural peculiarities. The handwritten daily schedule that governed my mature years became a testament to the possibility of minimizing suffering through careful attention to the practical details of existence. While complete liberation from the will might be reserved for rare saints and sages, I discovered that ordinary people could significantly reduce their burden of suffering by structuring their lives according to certain philosophical principles that I had tested through decades of personal experience. The first and perhaps most important of these principles was the deliberate cultivation of solitude. This was not misanthropy, though I was often accused of hating humanity. Rather, it was the recognition that most social interaction increases rather than decreases our suffering, because it forces us into constant negotiation with other people's wills, other people's demands, other people's expectations. When we are alone, we need only manage our own desires. When we are with others, we must also navigate the complex web of competing interests that inevitably leads to friction and disappointment. I structured my days to maximize periods of undisturbed solitude while maintaining just enough social contact to prevent complete isolation from becoming pathological. My mornings were reserved for writing and philosophical reflection, the hours when my mind was clearest and least likely to be disturbed by the emotional residue of human interaction. Afternoons I spent reading, walking, or listening to music. Evenings were sometimes devoted to carefully chosen social engagements, but always with the understanding that these were temporary concessions to social necessity rather than sources of genuine satisfaction. This schedule might seem rigid or overly controlled to someone who has not experienced the peace that comes from removing as many sources of unnecessary stimulation as possible from one's daily routine. But I had learned through painful experience that spontaneity usually meant reactivity, and reactivity usually meant suffering. When I allowed my days to be shaped by external demands and random impulses, I found myself constantly thrown off, balanced by unexpected desires, sudden irritations, and the emotional chaos that results from trying to satisfy the will's conflicting demands. Simultaneously, the management of expectations became another crucial element of practical wisdom. Most human suffering, I discovered, arises not from what actually happens to us, but from the gap between what happens and what we thought should happen. When we expect life to be fair, we suffer from its inevitable injustices. When we expect other people to understand and appreciate us, we suffer from their frequent indifference or misunderstanding. When we expect our efforts to be rewarded proportionally, we suffer from the randomness and unpredictability of outcomes. I learned to approach each day, each interaction, each undertaking with the lowest possible expectations. This was not pessimism in the usual sense, did not expect things to go badly, but rather a kind of philosophical neutrality that allowed me to receive whatever happened without the additional suffering that comes from disappointed hopes. When something pleasant occurred, it was a genuine surprise and could be enjoyed without reservation. When something unpleasant occurred, it was simply confirmation of life's ordinary character and could be endured without the extra burden of feeling betrayed by existence. Intellectual pursuits provided another reliable source of relief from the will's demands, though they could never eliminate those demands entirely. When I was deeply absorbed in philosophical problems, in reading great literature, or in contemplating the structure of reality, the constant pressure of personal desire would temporarily recede. These activities did not satisfy the will so much as distract it, giving consciousness a respite from its usual preoccupation with personal wants and fears. I made it a practice to spend several hours each day engaged in purely intellectual activity. Research aimed at advancing my career or winning recognition, but genuine inquiry pursued for its own sake. This distinction was crucial. When intellectual work is motivated by personal ambition, it becomes another form of willing and therefore another source of potential suffering. But when it arises from genuine curiosity about the nature of reality, it can provide temporary escape from the prison of individual selfhood. Physical health, I discovered, played a more important role in happiness than most philosophers acknowledged. When the body is uncomfortable, the mind finds it nearly impossible to achieve the kind of equanimity that makes philosophical wisdom practically applicable. I developed a routine of regular exercise, simple but nutritious meals, and sufficient sleep, not because I was particularly concerned with longevity, but because physical discomfort made every other form of suffering more acute. The cultivation of simple pleasures became another element of practical wisdom. While recognizing that all pleasure is ultimately temporary and therefore cannot provide lasting satisfaction, I learned to appreciate small, easily accessible sources of enjoyment that did not depend on external circumstances beyond my control. A well-prepared meal, a comfortable chair by the window, the sound of rain on the roof, the satisfaction of completing a piece of writing. These modest pleasures could not transform the fundamental conditions of existence, but they could make those conditions more bearable. Perhaps most importantly, I learned the art of acceptance, not passive resignation, but active acknowledgement of reality as it is, rather than as I wished it to be. When illness struck, I practiced experiencing the discomfort without the additional suffering that comes from fighting against the inevitable. When critics misunderstood my work, I practiced observing my disappointment without being overwhelmed by it. When old age began to limit my physical capabilities, I practiced adapting to new constraints without mourning the loss of what could no longer be recovered. This practical wisdom was not a cure for the human condition. Nothing could provide that, except perhaps the complete transcendence that remained beyond my reach. But it was a way of living that significantly reduced unnecessary suffering while allowing whatever joy was possible within the constraints of existence to emerge naturally. The daily schedule that structured my mature years was not a rigid prison, but a flexible framework that created space for both philosophical insight and simple human contentment to coexist as peacefully as possible. My father's pocket watch, which I carried with me every day after his death, became more than a mere timepiece, became a constant reminder of life's brevity and a teacher of the peculiar wisdom that comes only through direct confrontation with our own mortality. As the years accumulated and I felt the first subtle changes that herald the body's decline, I discovered that aging brings gifts that youth cannot imagine, chief among them a natural reduction in the will's intensity. An urgency the young man I had been was driven by desires that seemed absolutely crucial to satisfy. Recognition, as a philosopher, felt like a matter of life and death. Romantic attachments carried the weight of ultimate significance. Even minor social slights could disturb my peace for weeks. But as I moved through my 40s, 50s, and beyond, I noticed that these same desires began to feel less pressing, less immediate, less capable of completely disrupting my equilibrium. This was not mere resignation or defeat, though it might appear so to someone still in the grip of youthful ambition. Rather, it was as if the will itself was beginning to loosen its hold, to recognize that the body through which it operated was no longer the vigorous instrument it had once been. Sexual desire, which had once tormented me with its urgency, gradually subsided to more manageable levels. The need for social recognition, while never entirely absent, no longer dominated my thoughts or determined my mood from day to day. I began to understand why older people often possess a kind of philosophical equanimity that younger people find mysterious or even disturbing. It is not that age brings wisdom. Automatically many old people remain as driven by desire and as disturbed by disappointment as they were in youth. But for those who pay attention to the lessons that aging teaches, there is an opportunity to observe the will's operations from a perspective that is gradually becoming detached from complete identification with those operations. The approaching reality of death, rather than increasing my anxiety, actually brought a strange kind of relief. When you truly understand that your time is limited, many of the concerns that once seemed desperately important reveal themselves to be essentially trivial. The philosophical disputes that had once kept me awake at night, the social embarrassments that had once seemed unbearable, the material concerns that had once dominated my attention, all of these began to feel like the temporary preoccupations they had always been, but which the illusion of unlimited time had made seem permanent and crucial. I found myself thinking often about the curious relationship between time and suffering. In youth, we suffer intensely because we believe our current pain will last forever, and we strive desperately because we believe our current desires must be satisfied immediately. But with age comes the experiential knowledge that everything passes: pain and pleasure, success and failure, love and loss. This knowledge does not eliminate suffering, but it changes our relationship to suffering in ways that make it more bearable. The pocket watch ticking in my vest became a meditation device. Each tick a reminder that this moment, whatever its character, was already passing into memory. If the moment contained pain, the ticking promised that the pain would not last forever. If the moment contained pleasure, the ticking reminded me to appreciate it fully without clinging to it desperately. Time, which in youth had seemed like an enemy racing away with our opportunities, in age revealed itself as an ally helping to carry away our burdens. I began to see death not as the opposite of life, but as life's completion, the final release from the will's demands that aging was already beginning to provide in smaller doses. The fear of non-existence that had haunted my younger years gradually gave way to a kind of curiosity about what it might be like to no longer be driven by the endless cycle of desire and satisfaction that defines conscious existence. This changing relationship to mortality affected every aspect of my daily experience. Conversations with friends became more precious because I knew they were limited in number. Simple pleasures like morning coffee or afternoon walks gained intensity because I experienced them against the backdrop of their inevitable ending. Even my philosophical work took on a different quality, less driven by personal ambition and more motivated by a desire to leave behind whatever insights might be useful to others who would continue the human experiment after my departure. The wisdom of aging, I came to understand, is largely the wisdom of perspective. When you have lived long enough to see the same patterns repeat themselves many times, the same types of desires leading to the same types of disappointments, the same social dramas playing out with different actors, the same personal crises that once seemed unique revealing themselves as variations on universal themes, develop a kind of philosophical distance that makes both joy and sorrow more manageable. Yet this perspective did not make me indifferent to life or cynical about human experience. If anything, understanding the temporary nature of everything made each moment more vivid, each genuine pleasure more valuable, each opportunity for compassion more significant. The pocket watch that marked time's passage reminded me not to waste the precious hours that remained, but also not to grasp them so tightly that the very act of grasping prevented me from experiencing what they had to offer. A pressed rose from my youth, preserved between the pages of a philosophy book, served as a constant reminder of how even our most sublime emotions serve purposes that have nothing to do with individual happiness and everything to do with the will's relentless drive toward reproduction and species survival. My experiences with romantic love, painful as they often were, provided me with invaluable insights into the deceptive nature of what we consider our most elevated feelings. The woman who had given me that rose I will not name her, for she deserves privacy even in death, had stirred in me feelings so intense that I believed I had discovered the meaning of existence itself. When I was with her, the philosophical pessimism that usually colored my thoughts seemed to dissolve entirely. The world appeared beautiful, full of possibility, pregnant with meaning. I felt as though I had found the one person who could complete me, who could fill the fundamental emptiness that I had identified as the human condition. But as our relationship progressed, I began to observe, with the detached part of my mind that remained committed to philosophical investigation, how these seemingly transcendent feelings actually operated. The qualities that attracted me to her were not really about her as an individual person. They were about her fitness as a potential mother for my children, her genetic compatibility with my own biological inheritance, her capacity to contribute to the continuation of the species through our theoretical offspring. This realization was devastating and liberating in equal measure. Devastating because it meant that what I had taken to be the most personal and meaningful experience of my life was actually an impersonal biological program, operating through my consciousness without my awareness or consent. Liberating because it explained why romantic love so often leads to disappointment, conflict, and mutual suffering rather than the eternal bliss it seems to promise. The will, I came to understand, uses romantic attraction as one of its most sophisticated deceptions. It floods consciousness with feelings of meaning, purpose, and transcendent connection precisely because these feelings are necessary to overcome the rational mind's recognition that marriage and reproduction involve enormous sacrifice of individual freedom and happiness. If we could see clearly what we were getting into when we fell in love, most of us would choose solitude over the complications of intimate partnership. I observed this pattern not only in my own experience, but in the relationships of friends, neighbors, and acquaintances. The initial period of romantic intoxication, during which both partners feel they have found their perfect complement, is inevitably followed by a gradual recognition of incompatibility, competing needs, and conflicting desires. What had seemed like union reveals itself to be the temporary cooperation of two individual wills that remain fundamentally separate and often antagonistic. The institution of marriage, I concluded, is less a celebration of love than an attempt to create legal and social structures that will hold two people together after the biological imperative that brought them together has achieved its purpose or exhausted its energy. Most married couples I observed seemed to endure rather than enjoy their partnership, bound together by habit, duty, financial interdependence, and social expectations, rather than by the passionate connection that had originally united them. This insight did not make me cynical about human affection, but it did help me distinguish between genuine love and will-driven attraction. True affection, I discovered, arises from the recognition of shared humanity, from compassion for another person's suffering, from appreciation of their unique individual qualities, rather than their usefulness for species continuation. Such affection can exist between friends, between parent and child, between any two people who see past the biological and social roles they play to the essential being beneath. Romantic love, by contrast, is inherently possessive, jealous, and demanding. The lover wants to own the beloved, to be the sole source of their happiness, to merge with them in ways that would actually destroy both parties if such merger were possible. This is not personal failing, but biological programming The genes that create us are not interested in our individual happiness, but in their own replication, and they will gladly sacrifice our peace of mind to achieve their reproductive goals. Learned to value solitude not because I disliked human company, but because I had experienced how much emotional energy is consumed by the constant negotiation that intimate relationships require. When I was alone, I could pursue my philosophical investigations without having to consider how my thoughts or activities might affect another person's emotional state. I could structure my days according to what served my development, rather than what maintained domestic harmony. This choice was not without its costs. There were many evenings when I felt the ache of loneliness, many moments when I wondered what it might have been like to share my life's journey with a truly compatible companion. But I had learned to distinguish between the loneliness that comes from genuine isolation and the loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who cannot or will not understand what is most important to you. The pressed rose between my pages became a symbol of this hard-won wisdom, beautiful in its time, meaningful in its moment, but ultimately temporary, fragile, and incapable of providing the lasting satisfaction that the heart seeks when it mistakes biological attraction for metaphysical truth. Better to appreciate such beauty when it appears, to learn from it what it has to teach, but not to build one's entire philosophy of life around the assumption that such moments can be made permanent, or that they represent the deepest truth about human existence. A gold coin from my inheritance sits on my desk as I write these reflections, a symbol of how financial security, while practically necessary, cannot provide the satisfaction that the human heart ultimately seeks. My experience with wealth taught me lessons about the relationship between money and happiness that most people never have the opportunity to learn clearly, because they remain trapped either in poverty or in the endless pursuit of ever greater material accumulation. When my father died and left me financially independent, I expected this security to solve many of my problems and perhaps even to provide a foundation for genuine contentment. I would no longer need to worry about basic survival, no longer need to compromise my philosophical principles for the sake of earning a living, no longer need to depend on others for material support. In some ways, these expectations were fulfilled. Independence did provide me with the freedom to pursue my philosophical work without external interference, and it eliminated certain sources of anxiety that had plagued my earlier years. But I soon discovered that having enough money only highlighted more clearly the ways in which money cannot satisfy the deeper longings of human consciousness. The will's demands do not diminish when basic needs are met. They simply shift to more sophisticated forms. Instead of wanting food, shelter, and clothing, I found myself wanting recognition, influence, and legacy. Instead of worrying about survival, I began worrying about how to protect and manage what I had acquired. Observing wealthy acquaintances confirmed what my own experience had suggested, that money amplifies rather than eliminates the fundamental sources of human suffering. The rich worry about losing their wealth, about being loved for their money rather than for themselves, about whether their children will squander what has been accumulated. They compete with other wealthy people for status symbols that have no intrinsic value but serve as markers in elaborate social games. They often become suspicious of others' motives and isolated by their financial advantages from the genuine human connections that provide life's most reliable pleasures. Yet I also learned that having too little money creates its own forms of suffering that can overwhelm consciousness and make philosophical development nearly impossible. The person who cannot afford basic necessities, who lives in constant anxiety about survival, who must spend all their energy on immediate, practical concerns, has little opportunity to contemplate the deeper questions of existence. Poverty can be spiritually purifying for those who choose it voluntarily as part of a religious or philosophical discipline, but involuntary poverty is usually simply degrading and soul-crushing. The wisdom I extracted from my experience with money was that financial security is like health most valuable when it allows you to forget about it and focus on more important matters. Having enough money to meet basic needs without anxiety frees consciousness to pursue the kinds of experiences that can provide genuine, if temporary, satisfaction, intellectual development, aesthetic appreciation, authentic friendship, and the cultivation of wisdom. Society's obsession with wealth and status struck me as one of the most destructive, collective delusions of my era. People sacrifice their health, their relationships, their peace of mind, and often their integrity in pursuit of social recognition that provides no lasting satisfaction even when achieved. They mistake the symbols of success for success itself, the appearance of happiness for genuine contentment. The gold coin on my desk reminds me daily that money is a tool, nothing more useful for securing the conditions that make philosophical development possible, but incapable of providing the development itself. My philosophical manuscript, the pages of the world as will and representation that I labored over for so many years, taught me about the relationship between intellectual achievement and personal satisfaction. Writing that book was simultaneously the most fulfilling and the most frustrating experience of my philosophical career. Fulfilling because it gave me the opportunity to work out my understanding of existence in systematic detail, to trace the implications of my central insights through every area of human experience. Frustrating because I knew, even as I wrote, that intellectual understanding alone could not provide the liberation from suffering that such understanding seemed to promise. The process of writing forced me to confront the limitations of reason itself. I could analyze the operations of will with extraordinary precision, could map the structure of representation with philosophical rigor, could demonstrate the illusory nature of individual identity with logical clarity, but none of this intellectual mastery changed my fundamental condition as a being driven by desires I had not chosen, trapped in a body subject to aging and death, dependent on circumstances largely beyond my control. This recognition led me to a deeper humility about what philosophy could and could not accomplish. Philosophical insight can reduce unnecessary suffering by helping us understand which of our desires are based on illusion and which of our expectations are unrealistic. It can provide temporary relief from the will's demands by engaging consciousness in activities that transcend personal interest. It can even point toward the possibility of more complete liberation, though it cannot provide that liberation directly. But philosophy alone cannot transform the fundamental conditions of existence. For that, something more than intellectual understanding is required, something like the complete compassion and self-transcendence that I had observed in the great mystics and saints, but which remained largely beyond my personal reach. I began to distinguish between two different types of knowledge: abstract conceptual understanding and direct experiential insight. The first type, which dominates academic philosophy and scientific inquiry, operates entirely within the world of representation. It can analyze, categorize, and explain the appearances of things, but it remains trapped within the very framework it seeks to understand. No amount of conceptual knowledge about the nature of will can free us from will's operations, just as no amount of knowledge about the nature of dreams can wake us from a particular dream while we are still dreaming it. The second type of knowledge is more like recognition or remembering than like learning something new. It arises when consciousness temporarily transcends the boundaries of individual identity and perceives reality more directly. This kind of insight cannot be achieved through effort or study. It emerges spontaneously under certain conditions, often when the rational mind becomes quiet enough to allow deeper patterns of awareness to manifest. I experienced this difference most clearly in my encounters with great art and music. When I tried to analyze a Beethoven symphony intellectually to understand its harmonic structure, its formal organization, its relationship to other musical works, I could gain considerable conceptual knowledge, but this knowledge remained external to the music's essential impact. When I simply listened with complete attention, allowing the music to work on consciousness directly, without the interference of analytical thought, something much more profound occurred: a temporary dissolution of the boundaries between listener and music, between individual will and universal expression. The same pattern appeared in my philosophical investigations. The insights that proved most valuable were not those I reached through logical reasoning, though reasoning was often necessary to articulate and develop them, but those that emerged from sustained contemplation of existence itself. The understanding that individual identity is largely illusory, that suffering arises from the will's endless striving, that compassion flows naturally from the recognition of universal connection. These insights came not from reading other philosophers or following chains of logical argument, but from direct observation of consciousness and its operations. This taught me to value intellectual work differently than I had in my youth. In my early years, I had believed that philosophical understanding was valuable primarily for its own sake, that the pursuit of truth was the highest human activity regardless of its practical consequences. But as I matured, I began to see intellectual development as valuable mainly insofar as it supported the cultivation of wisdom, the kind of understanding that actually changes how we experience existence, rather than merely how we think about existence. The manuscript that contains my life's work stands as testimony to both the power and the limitations of rational inquiry. It preserves insights that might be useful to others walking similar paths, but it cannot transmit the experiential understanding from which those insights arose. Each reader must develop their own direct relationship with the realities I attempted to describe conceptually. A simple leaf from my garden became a daily teacher about the natural world's indifferent wisdom. Every morning I would observe how plants and animals embodied the will's operations without the additional complications that human consciousness creates. The rose bush outside my window grew toward sunlight, bloomed when conditions were favorable, withered when resources became scarcer, without the psychological suffering that accompanies similar processes in human life. Animals, I noticed, experience desire and satisfaction, pain and pleasure, but they do not seem to suffer from their desires in the way humans do. A cat hunting a mouse is completely absorbed in the activity, but when the hunt ends unsuccessfully, the cat does not appear to brood about failure or worry about future hunting opportunities. It simply moves on to other activities without carrying psychological residue from the unsuccessful pursuit. This observation suggested that much of human suffering comes not from the will's operations themselves, but from consciousness's tendency to elaborate on those operations, to create stories about what our desires mean, to judge ourselves for having desires, to worry about whether our desires will be satisfied, to compare our success at satisfying desires with other people's apparent success. The natural world demonstrated that it was possible to be driven by will without being tormented by will, though achieving this state while retaining human consciousness appeared to require the kind of wisdom that develops only through long experience and patient observation. My daily walks in nature became a practice of learning to perceive the world more directly, with less interference from personal judgment and interpretation. When I could observe a sunset or a flowing stream without immediately trying to fit the experience into some conceptual framework, when I could appreciate the intricate pattern of leaves on a tree without needing to understand what the pattern meant or how it related to my personal concerns, I experienced moments of peace that resembled what I imagined complete liberation might feel like. The seasonal cycles that I witnessed year after year taught me about the rhythm of growth and decay. that governs all existence. Spring's emergence of new life from winter's apparent death. Summer's abundance followed by autumn's gradual withdrawal. The quiet dormancy of winter that prepares for spring's return. These patterns revealed something essential about the nature of existence that human culture often tries to deny or overcome. We want spring to last forever, want to avoid autumn's declining, want to skip winter's darkness entirely. But nature shows us that each season has its own necessity, its own gifts, its own place in the larger cycle that makes life possible. Fighting against this rhythm is like trying to stop the ocean's tides, is exhausting, futile, and ultimately destructive to our own peace of mind. I began to see my own life's stages reflected in these natural cycles. Youth's passionate intensity corresponded to spring's explosive growth. Middle age's productivity mirrored summer's abundance. The gradual reduction of desires that came with aging resembled autumn's gentle withdrawal from the year's earlier ambitions. Even the approaching prospect of death seemed less frightening when understood as winter's necessary rest before consciousness returned to whatever source from which it had originally emerged. The leaf that I pressed between my journal pages represented this cyclical wisdom in miniature, beautiful in its brief moment of life, perfectly formed according to patterns older than human civilization, content to fulfill its simple function without demanding eternal duration or special recognition. When autumn came, it would fall naturally, returning its substance to the soil that would nourish future growth. There was no tragedy in this process, no sense of unfulfilled potential or wasted opportunity, only the completion of a cycle that had been perfect in its temporary manifestation. Observing insects, birds, and small mammals in my garden provided daily lessons in present moment consciousness. These creatures appeared to be completely absorbed in whatever activity currently engaged them, finding food, building nests, caring for offspring, seeking shelter without the constant mental commentary that makes similar activities sources of stress for human beings. They seemed to embody a natural mindfulness that we humans struggled to achieve through meditation and philosophical discipline. This did not mean that animal existence was superior to human. Existence consciousness brings gifts that more than compensate for its burdens, but it did suggest that we might learn something valuable from observing how life expresses itself through forms of awareness, less complicated by self-reflection and abstract thought. The garden became my monastery, the place where I practiced the art of accepting what is rather than insisting on what should be. Each day brought new opportunities to observe my own resistance to natural processes. My irritation when insects damaged plants I particularly enjoyed. My disappointment when weather prevented outdoor activities I had planned. My sadness when beloved trees showed signs of disease or age. Gradually, I learned to hold these preferences more lightly, to appreciate what was available without demanding that conditions remain permanently favorable to my personal desires. The bedroom candle that I extinguished each night became a symbol of the temporary respite that sleep provides from consciousness's struggle with existence. In sleep, the individual will becomes quiet, the constant chatter of personal desire falls silent, and we experience a kind of daily death that prefigures the final peace that awaits us all. I began to see sleep, not as time lost from living, but as a natural and necessary pause in the otherwise continuous effort required to maintain individual identity. Dreams fascinated me because they revealed how thoroughly the mind constructs the reality we take to be objective. In dreams, we experience entire worlds, complete with other people, complex situations, and strong emotions, all created entirely by our own consciousness, without any external input. This demonstrated how much of what we call reality is actually our mind's interpretation of raw sensory data, filtered through our expectations, desires, and fears. The fact that we can be completely convinced by dream experiences while we are having them only to recognize their illusory nature upon waking, suggested that our waking experience might be equally constructed and equally illusory, though at a level too fundamental for ordinary consciousness to recognize. This insight did not lead me to doubt the practical reality of the world around me, but it did reinforce my understanding that the boundaries between self and world, between inner and outer experience, are far less solid than they appear to everyday consciousness. I kept a dream journal for several years, recording not just the content of dreams, but my reflections on what they revealed about the workings of consciousness itself. What struck me most forcefully was how dreams demonstrated the will's continued operation even when the rational mind was offline. Dream scenarios invariably involved some form of desire, seeking something, fleeing from something, trying to accomplish something, struggling with obstacles or conflicts. Even in sleep, it seemed consciousness could not escape entirely from the fundamental pattern of wanting and striving that defines existence. But dreams also showed how this pattern could be experienced without the additional suffering that comes from taking our desires too seriously. In dreams, we pursue goals with passionate intensity, but upon waking, even the most vivid dream desires usually fade quickly into insignificance. This suggested a different way of relating to waking desires, not by eliminating them, which seemed impossible, but by holding them with the same lightness we naturally bring to dream experiences after waking. If I could remember that my current concerns might appear as insubstantial tomorrow as last night's dreams appear this morning, perhaps I could engage with life's challenges without being overwhelmed by their apparent urgency. The transition between waking and sleeping became a subject of particular fascination. In those moments, just before consciousness fades into sleep, there is often a gradual relaxation of the boundaries that normally define individual identity. Thoughts become less coherent, worries less pressing, the sense of being a separate self begins to dissolve. This dissolution, rather than being frightening, usually feels deeply peacefuler, release from the constant effort of maintaining personal identity. Similarly, the transition from sleep to waking often involves a gradual reconstitution of individual selfhood. In the first moments of awakening, there is sometimes a brief period when consciousness exists without clear personal boundaries, without immediate access to memories and concerns that define individual identity. These transitional states provided glimpses of what consciousness might be like without the overlay of personal will and individual striving. I began to pay careful attention to the quality of my sleep as a barometer of my overall relationship with existence. When I went to bed carrying the day's anxieties and resentments, sleep was often disturbed and unrefreshed. When I could release the day's events and approach sleep with acceptance of whatever the night might bring, rest came more easily and felt more restorative. The practice of consciously letting go of the day's concerns as I prepared for sleep became a form of philosophical exercise. Each night offered an opportunity to practice the kind of surrender that might eventually extend to larger aspects of existence, the surrender of specific outcomes, of personal preferences, of the need to control circumstances beyond my influence. The bedroom where I slept became a sanctuary not just from external distractions, but from the internal pressures that accompany waking consciousness. In that space, lit only by candlelight in the evening hours, I could practice the art of not that the day's activities made so difficult to maintain. The simple ritual of extinguishing the candle became a symbolic release of whatever burdens consciousness had accumulated during the day. Over time, I developed a deeper appreciation for sleep as one of existence's most reliable pleasures, not because it provided positive satisfaction, but because it offered temporary freedom from the need to seek satisfaction at all. In sleep, the will's demands became quiet. Individual identity relaxed its grip, and consciousness could rest from the constant effort of maintaining separate selfhood. This understanding transformed my relationship with insomnia, which had plagued me periodically throughout my life. Instead of fighting sleeplessness with anxiety and frustration, I learned to treat wakeful nights as opportunities for peaceful contemplation, times when consciousness could observe its own operations without the need to accomplish anything specific or solve any particular problems. My reading chair, worn smooth by decades of philosophical contemplation, witnessed the gradual development of what I came to think of as the gentle path to wisdom. This was not the dramatic enlightenment that transformed someone instantaneously from suffering to liberation, but the slow accumulation of understanding that makes life progressively more bearable and occasionally even pleasant. The gentle path involved no extraordinary practices or extreme disciplines. It required only sustained attention to the patterns of one's own experience, patient observation of how desire and satisfaction actually operate, and gradual acceptance of the conditions of existence that cannot be changed. Over time, this attention and acceptance naturally reduced the intensity of personal wanting and increased appreciation for whatever genuine pleasures were available within the constraints of individual existence. I learned to think of philosophical development like the wearing away of rough edges from a stone tumbled by water. Each experience of disappointment, each recognition of a desire's futility, each moment of genuine contentment contributed to a slowly developing equanimity that could not be forced but only allowed to emerge naturally through honest engagement with life as it actually is, rather than as we wish it were. The process was so gradual that it was often invisible from day to day, but looking back over years or decades, the transformation was unmistakable. Concerns that had once seemed desperately important revealed their relative insignificance. Pleasures that had once seemed insufficient revealed depths of satisfaction previously unnoticed. Relationships that had once seemed impossibly complicated became simpler when approached with fewer expectations and less need for specific outcomes. This gentle wisdom did not eliminate suffering. Nothing short of complete transcendence could accomplish that, but it changed suffering's quality and intensity in ways that made existence significantly more peaceful. Pain remained painful, loss remained difficult, aging remained challenging, but these inevitable experiences no longer carried the additional burden of resistance and resentment that had once made them nearly unbearable. The key insight that enabled this transformation was the recognition that most suffering comes not from our circumstances themselves, but from our relationship to those circumstances. When we demand that life be other than it is, when we insist that our desires must be satisfied for us to be content, when we resist the natural processes of change and loss that govern all existence, we add psychological suffering to whatever physical or emotional pain life naturally contains. But when we learn to hold our preferences lightly, to appreciate what we have without clinging to it desperately, to accept what we cannot change while working skillfully with what we can influence, then life becomes significantly more manageable. This is not passive resignation, but active wisdom, the discrimination between what deserves our energy and what does not, between what can be changed and what must be accepted. From my reading chair, I observed this principle at work in every area of human experience. Health problems became more bearable when I stopped fighting against the body's natural aging process and focused instead on maintaining whatever vitality was still possible. Professional disappointments lost much of their sting when I stopped measuring my worth by external recognition and found satisfaction in the work itself. Personal relationships improved when I stopped expecting other people to fulfill needs they were never designed to meet, and appreciated them for who they actually were, rather than who I wished they might become. The practice of gratitude, which I had initially dismissed as naive optimism, revealed itself to be a sophisticated philosophical discipline. Not gratitude for everything that happens. Some experiences deserve only acceptance. Not appreciation, but gratitude for the genuine gifts that existence offers to those who learn to notice them. the ability to think, to appreciate beauty, to experience moments of peace, to help alleviate others' suffering, to witness the magnificent complexity of the natural world. These capacities remain available even in the midst of personal difficulties. Developed the habit of spending a few minutes each evening before extinguishing my candle, reflecting on whatever had been genuinely valuable about the day just ending. This was not an exercise in forced positivity, but a training in attention, learning to notice sources of satisfaction that the will's constant forward momentum usually causes us to overlook. The reading chair also witnessed my growing understanding that wisdom cannot be rushed or forced. Many of the insights that proved most valuable came not through intense effort, but through patient waiting, through creating space for understanding to emerge naturally. The chair itself became a symbol of this patient receptivity, simply being present to whatever arose in consciousness without immediately trying to fix, analyze, or improve it. Sometimes the most profound insights came during periods when I was not consciously working on philosophical problems at all, but simply sitting quietly, allowing the mind to rest from its usual activities. In these moments of mental stillness, patterns that had been invisible during more active thinking would suddenly become clear. Solutions to long-standing questions would emerge effortlessly, or new questions would arise that opened previously. Unexplored territories of understanding. The gentle path taught me that transformation is always possible but never predictable, that healing happens in its own time and cannot be hurried, that wisdom grows like plants, slowly, naturally, with proper conditions but without force. My final letter, written in the last year of my life, attempted to summarize what I had learned about the art of living wisely within the constraints of human existence. The letter was addressed to a young philosopher who had written to me seeking guidance about how to endure the suffering that philosophical insights seemed to intensify rather than alleviate. I told him that understanding the nature of existence does indeed initially increase suffering, because it removes the comfortable illusions that most people use to make life bearable. When you truly understand that all striving leads ultimately to frustration, that all pleasure is temporary, that individual identity is largely constructed, that death is inevitable and meaning is not guaranteed, when you really see these truths clearly rather than merely accepting them intellectually, the initial effect is often despair. But I assured him that this despair, if endured with patience and courage, eventually transforms into something like peace. When you stop expecting existence to be other than it is, when you stop demanding that life provides satisfactions it cannot give, when you accept your own nature as a temporary manifestation of forces much larger than individual consciousness, then a different kind of contentment becomes possible. This contentment is not the fulfillment of desire, but the cessation of desperate desiring. It is not the achievement of personal goals, but the recognition that personal goals were never as important as they seemed. It is not the solving of life's problems, but the understanding that the deepest problems of existence cannot be solved, only accepted with whatever grace we can manage. I encouraged him to be patient with himself, to remember that wisdom develops slowly and cannot be forced, to appreciate whatever genuine pleasures life offered without demanding that these pleasures be permanent or complete. Most importantly, I urged him to use his philosophical understanding not as a weapon against life, but as a tool for reducing unnecessary suffering while accepting necessary suffering with dignity. The strange peace that I found in my final years was not the peace of having gotten what I wanted from life, but the peace of no longer wanting so desperately from life what it was never designed to give. This acceptance did not make me passive or resigned. I continued to write, to think, to engage with the world around me, but my engagement became lighter, less driven by personal ambition, more motivated by simple curiosity and compassion for other beings struggling with the same fundamental challenges. As I prepared these thoughts for those who might find them useful after my departure, I reflected on how sharing philosophical insights had become my way of contributing to the human experiment without expecting that contribution to solve anyone's problems permanently. Each person must work out their own relationship with existence, must find their own balance between striving and acceptance, must develop their own capacity for enduring necessary suffering while avoiding unnecessary suffering. My hope was that the insights I had gained through decades of observation and reflection might serve as useful tools for others embarking on their own philosophical journeys, not as final answers, but as starting points for the investigations that each conscious being must conduct for themselves. The wisdom of life, I had learned, could not be transmitted directly from teacher to student, but it could be encouraged, supported, and guided by those who had walked similar paths and discovered similar truths. The gentle farewell to consciousness that I anticipated was not an ending but a completion, not a defeat but a graduation from the school of individual existence. Whatever came after, whether continuation in some other form or simple cessation, could not be worse than the burden of maintaining separate selfhood, and might well be the peace that I had glimpsed in moments of deepest philosophical understanding, but never been able to sustain permanently while trapped within the boundaries of individual will. Looking back over my life's journey from the restless young man who could not sleep for all his anxious wanting to the old philosopher who had learned to find rest even in wakefulness, I saw a story not of conquest but of surrender, not of achievement but of acceptance, not of getting what I had wanted but of discovering that what I had wanted was not what I had actually needed. The sleepless nights that had once tormented me became, in memory, the very foundation of everything valuable I had discovered about existence. Those dark hours of questioning and despair had been necessary preparation for the insights that eventually brought peace. The suffering I had tried so desperately to escape had been the teacher that guided me toward whatever wisdom I had finally managed to develop. My final wish was that these reflections might serve as companions for others, walking the difficult but rewarding path toward whatever wisdom is possible within the constraints of human existence, helping them to suffer less and appreciate more the strange gift of temporary consciousness in an ultimately mysterious universe. And perhaps, when sleep finally comes, they too might find the peace that understands itself as never having been truly separate from the rest of existence at all.